Oh, thanks.
Is it on Amazon?
Yes, it is.
Is it everything on Amazon?
They're all on Amazon. I would say for the first 3 books, buy the ebook, don't buy the printed book, because the ebooks have active hypertext links in the bibliography back in the back.
Do you have audio?
No, but people have asked me about that.
Yeah.
So
I love to listen.
a lot of people do.
Because my eyes aren't the best.
I'm-
Need some new glasses.
I may be tempted to do that, because people have said, when the author reads the books, they like to buy that. Okay. Hello, and welcome to the Midweek Inspiration class here at Heartlight Spiritual Center in Charlotte, North Carolina. My name is Mark Hunter Brooks. I'm the author of the book Earth's Hidden Reality, and I'm a member here at Heartlight. And in April, David Hulse, the spiritual leader, asked me to speak to you about the process of spiritual development. And at that time, I gave you a presentation on the spiritual path model, which is something that I developed and is written in my book, Earth's Hidden Reality. In this class, I'm going to introduce you to something new. It's something that I developed after I published my 4th book. And it's relating a scale to the spiritual path model. So I wanted to show you how a scale which shows you different levels of consciousness maturity can align with the model so that you'll know what you're trying to do to mature your consciousness and how you go about it using the spiritual path model. And just a reminder, I developed this model as part of my spiritual journey, but over the years I've continued to enhance it so that now I can take you from having no spiritual background to having spiritual experience or mystical experiences. There's a number of models that are out there, and I encourage you to find one that you resonate with that matches the spiritual journey you're on, just as I did with mine. And let me get into the spiritual path model that we talked about previously in April, and I'll give you a couple highlights for it. It's showing up here on the screen. There's 5 different components to it. The first is spiritual training wheels. Those are those blue circles you see above and below the arrow. And then there's also red arrows associated with each of the training wheels. Those are the spiritual path on-ramps. And the third point, or the third part of this model, is the brown rectangles above and below the arrow. That's the spiritual supports that we have. Spiritual practice development. So as you come onto the spiritual path, you want to develop the ability to meditate or contemplate. You may want to develop any spiritual abilities that you have or that you may have been born with. And then also you want to develop a spiritual community. And I feel really blessed to be a part of the Heartlight community here, because I think it's a very vibrant community. But you want to have a group of people who think like you, so that when you reach periods of questioning or you get discouraged about your spiritual walk, you'll have people there who can encourage you and help you continue on your path. And that's an important part. We'll talk about this a little bit later, but a spiritual community is very important. Then next we have the arrow itself. That's the spiritual path, and I'm going to talk about that in more detail in a couple minutes. And the gray circle you see at the head of the arrow, that's the mystical path, and I'll also talk about that. The mystical path is more a path to union with God. The spiritual path, if you'll look at it, you'll see part of it's gray and part of it's blue. Down in the symbol key, you can see that spiritual path is, the gray side is the intellectually based faith or spirituality, and the blue is an internalized spirituality, and that's what I want to talk about in a couple minutes. Okay. So this is one of many scales that are published out there that are decades old or centuries old. But the one I like the best is called the Map of Consciousness, and it was developed by Dr. David Hawkins, and it shows you levels of spiritual maturity. And when you combine it with the model, the scale shows you what you have to do to develop your consciousness or mature your consciousness, and the spiritual path model shows you how to do it, and that's why these go hand in hand. So there's 3 parts of this model, this map of consciousness that I'm going to talk about in this presentation. That's where those 3 arrows are. They relate to the maturity level of courage, the interface between reason and love, and the maturity level of enlightenment. And these are different points along the spiritual path model that I want to relate them to. Now, let's talk about the spiritual path on-ramps and the training wheels. These training wheels represent life events that can affect your spiritual development. And there's 3 different types of them. The 2 on the top are similar, and the 1 on the bottom is much different from the others. But you can have life experiences, spiritual experiences that you don't understand, that you want to find out more about. You can have philosophical questions that you can't answer, that are always bothering you, that could lead you onto a spiritual path. You could have trials or tests in your life. And for all 3 of these spiritual training wheels, they can happen throughout your lifetime, whether you're on a spiritual path or not. But these are designed to teach you things to mature your consciousness, to help you with your spiritual development. And just to talk about these 2 spiritual training wheels up top, you'll see that you start the wheel at the bottom because this is sitting on top of the arrows. So you start from the bottom and do a circle and come back onto the path. But with experiences and questions, you have an event that causes you to question, which leads you to a period of reflection, which once you figure out what you want to do to change your life, you integrate it into your life or assimilate it into your life. The same thing is true with trials and tests. You'll have a trial or a test that could lead to a period of suffering, which leads to a period of reflection, to a period of integration, and puts you back on the spiritual path. Now, the emotions and ego training wheel is different from the others because it relates to immature emotions or overbearing egos, things that need to be smoothed out to be socially acceptable. And you may know people who have exhibited, things like that. And you may be discouraged or offended, by things that people say or things that they do. But they're going through their spiritual development as well. And you need to look at the level of maturity that they're at. And they're in the growth process in addition to what you're doing and what everyone else around you is doing. So when they say or do things that you disagree with or that you find offensive, it creates opposites, people who just don't want to be associated with you. But at some point, you create a critical mass of people that start to actively resist you, which leads to a fall and a period of reflection, just like with the other 2 spiritual training wheels. And eventually, you come to a commitment to change, a sincere commitment to change your emotions, to change your ego, to become more socially acceptable. And I wanted to make a point here with this training wheel because there's a piece for the people who have been affected by those emotions or ego, and they need to forgive. And you may have heard me say this before. I'm sure you've heard David say this many times, is the importance of forgiveness. And from a spiritual maturity level, this person who's on this spiritual training wheel can't complete the wheel until you forgive them and restore them. And a lot of times, people can't get it done the first time around, so they may take 2, 3, 5, 8 times to get it right. But it's important that you forgive people every time so that they can complete this wheel and get back on where they are. Now, how do the training wheels align with the map of consciousness? This is that first arrow that we talked about in the chart, the maturity level of courage. And the different maturity levels below courage are self-centered or selfish-related maturity levels. So you may know people who exhibit emotions of shame, guilt, apathy, grief, fear, desire, anger, or pride. That's more self-centered. It's more selfish. But when you have courage, the maturity level of courage, that's where you start thinking of other people first. And you can think of soldiers on a battlefield or first responders who are putting their lives at risk, to think of their families, their friends, their loved ones, their community, or their country. And this is where you start thinking of other people first. And that brings you to maturity levels of willingness, acceptance, and love. So that's the purpose of the training wheels, is to take you up to this level of courage. And we're going to get to the next level, or the next part of the path, which is the spiritual path itself. Let's do the next page, please. There we go. So the spiritual path I'm going to get into a page of text. I want you to look at this arrow first, see that there's 4 stages or 4 steps below or before this brick wall and 2 steps after the brick wall, and then you have the head of the arrow at the end. But this is 6 different steps and 1 point of reconciliation that's part of the spiritual path. And they're defined as recognition, acknowledging the possibility that there's something greater than what you see and hear going on in your everyday life, and a desire to understand more. Then the next 2 steps alternate back and forth with each other. It's a period of study and a period of application of what you've studied. So when you want to find out more about spirituality, you'll hit the books. You'll buy books about metaphysics. You'll read scripture. You'll talk to people who want to be spiritual mentors or do discipleship and faith traditions or religion. But you'll do periods of study. And when you complete those periods of study, you may want to start doing acts of service for others, or take on spiritual leadership roles in faith traditions or religions. But a lot of people move between this 2nd and 3rd stage in the spiritual path model. But eventually, you'll come to a point where you start questioning what you believe or what you've been taught or what you understand. And that's this period or this step of questioning. And it leads to the wall, which is this step of reconciliation. But you start questioning what you believe and moving into a point to where you just stop dead in your tracks. That's the wall. And that's where what you intellectually understand about spirituality conflicts with your life experiences and your spiritual practices, assuming you've been doing your spiritual practice all along as you've been moving through these different steps. And I wanted to emphasize with the wall that you don't want to dismiss this period of reflection. It's important to go through, so don't diminish some of the conflicts that you have and don't overlook them, but sit there and wrestle with them. That's what's important about this point. But when you can reconcile what you intellectually understand about spirituality with your life experiences and your spiritual practice, you can internalize it. And that gives you a spirituality that's not only intellectually based, but it's experientially based as well. And you've integrated multiple different paths, spiritual paths that you've been on, into one. And that's what's important to achieve. So it's okay to question what you believe, because the ultimate goal is going to be a spirituality that's much stronger than what you have right now. And for people in your spiritual community, it's important for them to encourage you to stay with it, stay with that period of questioning, stay with that period of uncertainty, because as you get through it, you'll have something much better than what you had before. And that's what's important. So let me talk about the wall just a little bit more on page 9. The wall is important because it's that integration point. Whoops. Yeah, there we go. It's the integration point for all these different types of spirituality that you have, your intellectual understanding, your life experiences, your spiritual practice. It's an integration point. And that's a very powerful point in this spiritual path model. And the one that I chose to make part of my personal model, it came from a book called The Critical Journey by, I forget her last name, Hagberg and Gulich. But I wrote about them in the bibliography at the end. I've got the books right up here. But you want to find a spiritual path model that resonates with the path that you're on or that you've been on. So how does the wall align with the map of consciousness? That's this inflection point between the maturity level of reason and the maturity level of love. So it's at the upper end of the map of consciousness, but it's where you go from this intellectual understanding of spirituality to a more loving, integrated spirituality that includes your experiences as well as your intellectual knowledge. And let me also say too, for people who are thinking about spiritual development, this model gives you a unique spirituality because it combines your intellectual understanding with your life experiences. So your spirituality, everyone's spirituality is unique. It's not a cookie cutter that's a product of religion or a faith tradition, but it's a unique perspective on spirituality. And that's why we can all learn from each other, because we've all had different life experiences that have led us to where we are in our spiritual walk and our spiritual journey. So when you go through the spiritual path, it's not the end, it's just the beginning. Going through the path, the spiritual path the first time, it sets a baseline for what you believe. And you have 3 different paths that you can follow after you complete the spiritual path. The first path, going through the wall and integrating what you understand and developing this life of love. You can continue to expand the breadth of your love for others. You can move to develop perseverance and moral courage in what you believe, and being able to defend other people and defend what you believe. Know what you stand for and be able to defend it. And you can go on to the mystical path as well. But that's what this chart represents. This is in my 3rd book. It's not in my 4th book. But this is what happens after you complete the path on the first pass. The goal is to expand your love for others, expand your perseverance and your ability to defend what you believe, and then move on to this mystical path as well. So there's a difference between the spiritual path and the mystical path. And the mystical path is when you know that the spirit world exists. That's the big difference. With the spiritual path, when you have this period of recognition, you have questions that something more than what you see and feel and hear may exist. But with this spiritual awakening at the start of the mystical path, you know that the spirit world exists. And that's what actually is the introduction to the mystical path for you. And there's a number of different steps that you go through to reach it. You have the spiritual awakening, which is the realization the spirit world exists. But then it takes you into this desire to purify your heart and your mind, and the realization of the world's illusions and some of your own personal imperfections. That leads you to your initial spiritual communications and some of the spiritual abilities that you may have in voices and visions. And then as what you believe and understand and what you've experienced diverges from the general population, you may find yourself becoming more introverted and being in longer periods of solitude. But this is important as well, because it helps you to continue to develop. And then also too, if you have family and friends, I don't know if you've had experiences like this before, where you start talking to them about what you believe or what you've experienced, and they try and shut you down. So if you get by yourself, if you have these periods of solitude, it helps you change how you believe and what you believe, and it's a very important part of this mystical path. But this also leads to experiences of ecstasy and rapture as you start developing greater spiritual abilities. And that leads you to what I call, or what is called, the dark night of the soul, which is where you've controlled your emotions, you've controlled your ego, and then to get to these more powerful instances of spiritual abilities, you have to control your thoughts as well, because these spiritual abilities are thought responsive. So when you can get rid of your ego, your emotions, and your thoughts, you say, why do I have this, or I have no desire to be here, to be on earth. There's no reason for me to be here, for me to live. And that's actually a good thing, because it signifies that this is the end of your periods of reincarnation, because you've learned everything that you need to learn, or that you should learn, in order to move forward in your spiritual development beyond earth. And that leads you to this next step of mystical union, which is a transcendence and a leading of a spiritual life. And some people call that a mystical union with God. So let me talk about the dark night of the soul. How do you get past the dark night of the soul? is you have to change your worldview and your ideas of accumulating wealth. So think of your worldview now. It's very earthly, very temporal. When you have no desire left, no emotions, ego, or thoughts, the way you get past this dark night of the soul is to change your worldview from an earthly worldview to a spiritual worldview, so that you're thinking more about your spiritual life, your spiritual existence. And then also, too, the way you accumulate wealth from an earthly perspective is with power, influence, authority, money, celebrity. You'll change that as well when you have no, emotions, ego, or thoughts. When you have this lack of desire, if you change the way you accumulate wealth to doing acts of service for other people and to develop goodwill from other people, that allows you to pass through this period of the dark night of the soul. So let me give you a couple spiritual explanations for Bible scripture. And this is coming from the Greek Bible or the Christian New Testament, from Matthew chapter 6, verses 19 through 21 and verse 24. And this scripture is from the New International Version. Verses 19 through 21 say, "Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moths and vermin destroy, or where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where moths and vermin do not destroy, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." And this is talking about building spiritual wealth through acts of service and goodwill from others, because that's not easily destroyed, unlike material wealth that can be destroyed in an economic crisis or fires or other types of natural disasters. Then in verse 24, it says, "No one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you'll be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money." This talks about your worldview. You can't have both an earthly worldview and a spiritual worldview. You have to have one or the other. And when I was reading this and reviewing this for this presentation, it made me think of a parable, which is also from the Greek Bible, from Matthew chapter 9, verses 16 and 17. And I wanted to share it with you. And it's the parable of new cloth on an old coat, or new and old wineskins. You may be familiar with it. And starting with verse 16, it says, "No one sews a patch of unshrunk cloth on an old garment, for the patch will pull away from the garment, making the tear worse. Neither do people pour new wine into old wineskins. If they do, the skins will burst, the wine will run out, and the wineskins will be ruined. No, they pour new wine into new wineskins, and both are preserved." Now, the literal interpretation of that is you don't want to put a new patch on an old coat, because the new patch is going to shrink when it goes in the wash. And when the patch shrinks, it can make the tear even worse than what you had. Similarly, with the wineskins, new wine still is fermenting and breathing, and so it's stretching. But if you have old wineskins, they don't stretch. They aren't flexible. And so they'll break if you put new wine in it. So from a literal translation, put the new wine in new wineskins. What it means from a spiritual perspective is that when you change your heart and mind to a spiritual perspective, you need to change your actions as well. And I'm going to read this text, and this is from my book. "When one becomes spiritually mature, they must also change their actions to conform to their mind's new worldview. If they don't do this, their new spiritual maturity will simply mask the continuation of their old actions." And I was referencing a book called The Perennial Philosophy by Aldous Huxley. And he's the author of the book Brave New World. But he did a book on spirituality. And in chapter 20, he described this situation. He said he described it as turning to God without turning from self. And Huxley went on to explain that there have been centuries of follies and iniquities that were committed in the name of religion, where religion masked the actions that were still earthly actions of the individual. So I thought that was important to share with you as well. Now, where does the dark night of the soul fall on the map of consciousness? It's up at the very top. That's this maturity level of enlightenment where it falls. So you're at the end of the mystical path. You're at the very top end of this map of consciousness as well. So let me summarize these 3 points that we had on the spiritual path model. The on-ramps and training wheels, the wall, and the dark night of the soul. And those were the 3 points that I showed you where they aligned with the map of consciousness. Now let me show you a little bit more detail about that. So you can see where each one of these map with courage, love and reason, and enlightenment. This arrow in the middle represents the growth of your spiritual maturity. And when you reach the point of courage on the map of consciousness, that's the transition from your self-centered behavior to an other-centered behavior, or it's a mind transformation. In the middle, when you make this transition from a maturity level of reason to a maturity level of love, that's part of this reconciliation and internalization that you did on the spiritual path model, which is taking you from multiple paths of spirituality, your intellectual understanding, life experiences, and spiritual practice, to an integrated spirituality, one that's much stronger than any individual one. Then third, with the dark night of the soul, which is up at this maturity level of enlightenment, this is a transition of your soul, or transformation of your soul, from an earthly centered version to a spiritually centered view. And I'll use this to explain more Bible scripture. So, yeah, this is heavy on the Bible. Sorry about this. But from Matthew chapter 20, verses 26 through 27, this was where Jesus was talking to his disciples, and the mother of 2 of the disciples had just asked Jesus, "Can my son sit on either side of your throne when you come into your glory in heaven?" You know, and he was saying all these things, but he went on to say that whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be your slave. And a lot of people have interpreted this as being servant leadership. But if you look at it from this map of consciousness and the spiritual path model, and from maturity levels, you can see that the people at the highest level of spiritual maturity are the ones with this spiritual worldview and this intense desire to be of service to other people and build goodwill. So this is a spiritual explanation for that verse. Now there's also some life applications to this model and this integration of the map of consciousness with the model as well. And I wanted to share with you a quote from Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning. And Viktor Frankl was a Jewish psychiatrist who was imprisoned at Auschwitz, the concentration camp in World War II. And he was looking out over the compound one morning, and he said that he saw just a few people, a few men, going around giving away their last scraps of bread and encouraging the other people. And this is where the quote comes in. He said he realized at that moment that you can take everything away from a person except for one thing, that last of human freedoms, the freedom to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. And this is what I believe is the essence of spiritual development and spiritual maturity. You may not have, or you have no control over what happens to you, but you have total control over how you choose to respond to that. And it's through going through the spiritual path model, going through this map of consciousness and these maturity levels, that you develop a more loving, a more caring, a more empathic response to people who may offend you, who may, try and attack you. You'll be able to see them as fellow spiritual journeyers on this path and react more with compassion and empathy than you might if you weren't so high up on the spiritual path model. So I hope that helps you understand this a little bit more. And this leads me to the closing. And I said this in the first presentation as well. You're responsible for your own spiritual development. No one can do it for you. And I gave you the old saying, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. So you're responsible for your intellectual understanding of spirituality, your experiential understanding of spirituality, the development of a spiritual community, and the maintenance of your spiritual community as well, being an active participant in it, the development of your spiritual gifts and their use, and then also spiritual evolution. And I wanted to talk to you a little bit about spiritual evolution as well, because some people may be reluctant to pass on what they've learned about their spirituality and the path that they've walked, but it's very important that you share that with your children and your grandchildren. So there was a book that was published, I believe, in the 1980s, 1990s. It was called The Blind Watchmaker. And it was by Professor Richard Dawkins. And he was an atheist, and he was trying to put forth an argument of why evolution is better than, or more accurate than creationism. But as part of this book, he talked about a computer program that he created. And he created 100 instances of 28 randomly generated characters. And then he was using the computer program to modify those individual instances by randomly changing different characters. What he was hoping to get was a 28 character phrase, "Methinks it's like a weasel," from Shakespeare's play Hamlet. And he deduced from statistics that if you just do this random changing without any organization, the probability of hitting that is 1 in 10 to the 40th, which is a decimal point with 40 zeros and a 1. Very, very small probability. But he created a subroutine and ran the program with a subroutine that emulated physical evolution. And what he did was, when he made the changes in one iteration, he went through the 100 different instances to see which one came the closest to the end goal, "Methinks it's like a weasel." And he made that the parent for all of the instances in each succeeding iteration. And he went from a probability of 1 in 10 to the 40th to get that phrase to 50 iterations. So it was a huge change just because of that one little change he did in the program. And that he used to prove the power of physical evolution. But it applies to spiritual evolution as well. So if you pass on what you've learned and what you know spiritually to your children and grandchildren, you exponentially increase their abilities to progress spiritually in their own lives and the lives of their children and grandchildren. But the opposite also exists, and this is what's important, is that if you don't share that spiritual knowledge, eventually the probability of your children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren developing spiritually is going to be reduced to statistical chance. And that's what I wanted to leave you with today. Yes. So here are the books that I referenced in this presentation. I have, or we can put a digital copy of the presentation up here so you can have access to the books. If you have any questions that you don't ask here today, you can send me an email at mark@markhbrooks.com. I'll be happy to respond. And with that, do you all have any questions? Yeah, thanks. I'm going to put my glasses on now so I can see your faces. Hey, Bonnie.
I saw up there you had a book, a reference with Viktor Frankl.
Yes, and I didn't have it up in the bibliography, but it's Man's Search for Meaning.
Okay.
Is the name of it. And what I quoted was between pages 65 and 66 of that book.
And is he still around?
No.
He's probably gone.
Yeah, he's gone. He transitioned a while back.
Oh, yeah, as much. He was in the Holocaust.
But his book, he talked about a type of therapy he called logotherapy. And it was a very impressive book. It's one of the top sellers on Amazon.
What kind of therapy?
Logotherapy. Logo.
Oh, logo.
Yeah. But it's one of the top selling books in the categories that his book's under, like in the top 100. You know, it's a very impressive book. So it would be a good read if you wanted to get it. And then this book, The Map of Consciousness by David Hawkins, this goes into in incredible detail in talking about the map of consciousness. I didn't want to talk about it today because, you know, I didn't want to run into any copyright infringement issues. But it is a good complement to this spiritual path model. And I would encourage you to get the book. There's also workshops you could attend where they teach you about it. But you can go into a lot of detail. There's multiple books and multiple workshops you could attend.
Would you talk a little bit about your
path of growth?
Yes.
If you feel confident.
Well, I had spiritual experiences. I came on the on-ramp of questioning and experiences. So I had a number of spiritual experiences that I couldn't explain. And that led me to buy a lot of books to figure out what had happened to me. And, watched a lot of videos, talked to a lot of people. But that's how I came onto the spiritual path. And it took me probably 7 or 8 years to go through that initial path. And it took 1.5 years for me to go through the wall. So it isn't something you'll get in a few days or a few weeks. It could take a few months or 1 year or 2. But it's important to wrestle with that. And I said in the book, the way I finally got through the wall was I had to give up my belief in the Trinity, which was pretty key. And a lot of people would raise eyebrows at that. But I was able to get that belief back with a spiritual understanding of the Trinity later on. So things that you may have to give up to complete that reconciliation and internalization process, you may be able to reacquire later on. And that's the positive side of that. But don't be afraid to give up beliefs that you can't reconcile to help you move through the wall.
It's hard to do that, though.
It's incredibly hard. It's incredibly hard. And you won't know how hard it is until you get there. But I would say I'm part of the way up the mystical path. I've kind of reached this period of introversion, if you want to say, with things. But I'm, reaching out to more and more people to expand my breadth of love. I need to do a lot of work on perseverance because I'm a wimp in that regard. And that's one place where I need to do a lot of work. And I'm sure you all have seen people, or maybe you've experienced it yourself, where you've been in these situations where you say, dang, if I had just said this, or I wish I could have defended that person. I wish I could have stood up to this person who was saying all these things because I knew that they were wrong. You have to go through a few experiences like that and beat yourself up a few times before you really start wanting to take a stand for people. But it all comes back to, and I say it's 6 things now. When I was talking to you in April, it was 4. It was know who you are and what you believe. Know where you are on your spiritual journey and where you're going, and that's what the spiritual path model can help you with. And know what you stand for and why.
All of those are difficult.
They're all difficult, but they're all very, very important, and it really helps round you out as an individual. But it's something to achieve, and you also realize you can't do it in and of yourself.
Isn't the why kind of universal?
The why?
Yes. Why you,
What do you mean?
I think that was one of the words, experiences you go through and the why you are doing
Oh,
this.
it's
Isn't
know
that kind of universal?
know what you stand for, or know what you believe and why.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a lot of people have just an intellectual understanding of beliefs, and they don't really know how to back it up. And it's hard for people to take a stand on things that they only have, like a book or something that they've heard to back up what they say they believe in. But it's important to have thought about all these things and to have some rock solid documentation or some rock solid experiences that you can refer to say, this is what I believe and this is why I believe it. And I think it's very important too for people here at Heartlight to have a spiritual understanding of Scripture, because a lot of people have a literal interpretation of it. David talked about hints and hinting. Some people will have that interpretation. Some people will have interpretations based on references to how it's presented in other parts of Scripture, relating back to it, or allegorical or metaphorical interpretations of it. But there's a spiritual interpretation to Scripture too, and I think it's very important that people who have a spiritual understanding of faith or spirituality understand that spiritual component of Scripture in different faiths, not necessarily just Judaism or Christianity or Islam in the Western faith traditions, but the Eastern ones as well. There's spiritual interpretations to all these different things, and it's important to have that spiritual, scriptural interpretation, and then that spiritual, experiential interpretation as well. You need to have both of them together, because if you just have one or the other, you'll either have this literal fundamentalism, or you'll have a bunch of empty words that you're basing all your stuff on. So when you have them all together, it really creates a strong understanding and a strong reason for why you believe it. I hope that answered the question. Now, whether I can do that yet or not, no. Like I said, I'm a wimp when it comes to perseverance, and that's something I've got to do a lot of work on. Yeah.
Can you explain a little more about the dark night of the soul?
That's coming from Evelyn Underhill's book, Mysticism. I know there's a lot of different interpretations for the dark night of the soul. This was the interpretation she had. This is the seminal work on mysticism, and it was written in the early 1900s. Evelyn Underhill on Mysticism, a study in the nature and development of spiritual consciousness. Now, her writing is early 20th century English, so it's a little bit hard to get through, but it has a lot of things in it. So I'll tell you, this is the way she did her chapters, is she summarized the chapters up here. This was like an older way of writing details about stuff. So she put an abstract up here, but her chapters are like 30 and 40 pages. So, but they're very complete. She goes into, the medieval times and monastics, monks and nuns, things that they experienced and went through. So she covers a lot of ground in that book. It was a very complete book that she did. But what I talked about in The Dark Night of the Soul, that was her explanation of when you've gotten to the point to where you've controlled or eliminated your emotions and your ego, and then as you're on this mystical path and you start controlling and eliminating your thoughts so that you can have these greater spiritual abilities that are more thought responsive, that's what leads you to this period of a lack of desire to continue living on earth. And that's what she was saying in her book. And there's different interpretations for the dark night of the soul. Different people have different interpretations of it, so I'm not saying that's the only one. And you may be familiar with other interpretations of it, but that was the one that she had in this book. And this is one of the last things that I added to my spiritual path model, so I'm still reading and developing my thoughts on this as well. So,
What's the name of her book again?
It's titled Mysticism, A Study in the Nature and Development of Spiritual Consciousness. And it's Evelyn Underhill, Underhill. And then here's Aldous Huxley's book, The Perennial Philosophy. There's a couple other books that are out there where the authors have taken, or they've collected sayings or quotes from different spiritual leaders in both the Eastern and Western traditions, and talk or put them in chapters related to the nature, what is it? God in the world, charity, truth, religion and temperament, grace and free will, good and evil, time and eternity, salvation, deliverance and enlightenment. A lot of spiritual topics. But Aldous Huxley is one of the more famous authors who did a book like that.
Can you share one of your spiritual experiences?
Oh my gosh. No start,
You can
please.
say no.
If you want to.
Yeah, so my experiences started in 2003, so really about 2 decades worth. And it started out really as being able to feel spiritual entities and then hear them. So, and it's kind of grown from there. But that was 20 years ago.
Did it frighten you at first?
Yes, it scared the crap out of me for about 3 years. So, and I want to be vulnerable about that, and I don't mind saying some of those things, because so many people are shut down when they want to talk about their spiritual experiences or things that have happened to them. So I would encourage you to be open about what you've experienced as well, because there's so many people who have been shut down by their family or their friends when they tried to talk about it, and there's this whole part of them that you never see. and I was associated with the International Association for Near-Death Studies. I was part of the Charlotte chapter here. And we went, or the place where we were meeting, the lady who was a volunteer at the desk, front desk where we checked in at, she had had a near-death experience 20 years before, and her family shut her down. So she had had this experience that she had not talked to anyone about for 20 years. And similarly, there was one time we went to a restaurant, and our waiter had nearly drowned in the ocean 15 years ago, and his buddy had drowned. And he had these guilt feelings for, why did I live and my buddy die? And then his buddy came to him one night in, as a ghost or whatever, and told him, don't worry, it wasn't your fault. Don't have these guilty feelings. But he couldn't share that with anybody. We were the first people he had told in like 15 years, only because he asked us what this group was, and we told him. So, you never know what people may have that, has been bottled up inside them. And then also, too, there's a whole part of individuals that can never be shared with other people. And that's what I like about Heartlight, because I can be open about what I've experienced here, because everybody can relate to it. But in some faith traditions or some denominations, you don't dare share it, So it's important to be able to give people that opportunity.
And sometimes in these faith-based religions, you might mention something and no one says anything in the group, but quietly they come to you afterwards and say, I need to talk to you about my experiences.
Yeah.
Because it gives them a voice.
That's true.
Yeah.
And also too, be persistent about talking about things, because your persistence helps people feel more confident about talking about things as well. If you say something once or twice and you get shut down, then that's not going to be a good encouragement for somebody else to come forward. Yeah, but I've been in situations with some church groups and stuff where I've said something, and all of a sudden there was this hush over the room, and I went, oh, what did I say? What did I do? And I mentioned this in my book too, is when my first books came out, I would give copies to the preacher and the elders at my church. It was just as a courtesy to say, hey, this is what I wrote, just in case anybody says anything or whatever. But I told them this, and I also said this when I went to a Jewish congregation to their Torah study for about 3 years. I said, I will not consciously say or do anything contrary to what the preacher or the rabbis or the cantors teach, because I want to edify the congregation. I want to help people along in their spiritual walk and journey. So, but by saying that, there's a whole side of me that I couldn't share with people, at my church, because I didn't want to say anything contrary to what they were teaching. So it's something good to say to give confidence to people that you're with, but it can also be limiting too.
Were they more open and receptive at the temple as far as spirituality?
Yes. This was what do you call it? I guess a Reformed Jewish congregation. You know which one I'm talking about, I think. And they were very spiritual.
Was it here?
Yes.
Okay.
And the lady who was the senior rabbi, she's Judy. She was very spiritual. And then her assistant rabbi, extremely spiritual guy. He went up to Buffalo, I think, afterwards. But a very spiritual congregation. And then also too, when I would go to their services, I agreed with everything they said. They just didn't talk about Jesus, but they were saying everything that a Christian congregation would say. And the beliefs were very similar. So, but very spiritual congregation. And you wouldn't, if you haven't been previously exposed to it, you wouldn't necessarily think that you would find that, but I was pleasantly surprised and really happy. And also too, if you ever wanted to go to a Torah study, Jewish congregations have beaten the crap out of those first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible. And they have allegories and different relationships between Scripture that you'd never hear in a Christian church. So you really find out some new and exciting and different things.
Isn't the Old
by having
Testament different than what Christians get? Isn't it rearranged differently?
The Torah is the same, But the books in the Christian Bible are rearranged differently than in the Tanakh, in the Hebrew Bible.
That's what I thought.
Yeah, but and some of them have different names. One thing that I thought was kind of interesting, talking about the Greek Bible or the Christian New Testament, was the book of James. Is that when I went to this Jewish congregation, they said there's no Jewish word for James. It's Jacob. But when you had the King James version, you know, the book of James appeared. And I thought that was what they were saying. And I said, wow, I like that relationship. But it was kind of interesting. And this is captured on live stream, so it's going to be preserved for posterity here.
Well, we can refer to it again.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
But I thought that was interesting. It was one of the things that I found there that I thought was very interesting. A lot of different perspectives that you'd never get. And the Christian churches where I took classes on Judaism, completely different from what Judaism actually was. So don't think you know it until you've been there and experienced it. It's a big difference. So are there any other questions? All right. Oh, Nancy. Uh-oh.
Is there, I was just reading your book and was thinking it would be cool to do an exercise. And the first one in the back of your book is how I sensitize my body. Is there a way that we can do that together here now?
It took about 18 months for me to do that. And I was doing things over the weekend, but basically it was Qigong exercises. And I tell people, find a mentor. Don't try and do these things on your own. And I actually wrote a chapter in my book, I think it was chapter 10, and I titled it, Fools Go Where Angels Fear to Tread. You know, so always have someone who's walked that path before to show you where it is and what you're doing, because you can get lost or, you know, off in a ditch somewhere really quick if you aren't careful.
Because each movement and each vibration changes according to the movements you're making. You can screw it up very easily.
Right.
I found out.
And I wrote in my book that there was one exercise that I didn't do correctly, and I ended up stuttering for 1.5 years.
Wow.
Yeah, so you got to be careful. Be careful what you do around your brain and around your spine. Yeah, and I didn't do anything wrong around my spine, but I kind of messed up with my head.
Physically, what you do to it?
Or both.
It was just the Qigong exercises. The way I did it was wrong, but it made me stutter for a while.
By the way, we did some Qigong this morning. It was really good.
Oh
Very
yeah,
good. Excellent.
good stuff. But have a mentor. Have someone who can teach you the proper way to do it. Anything else? Any other questions? Well, if not, thank you, everybody, and thank you for the people online who are joining us on the live stream. This is Heartlight Spiritual Center in Charlotte, North Carolina, and the Midweek Inspiration Service. I hope you got something interesting and positive and motivating as a result. Take care and have a good week.
Thank you.
Take care. Thanks, Karen. Hello, and welcome to the Midweek Inspiration class at Heartlight Spiritual Center here in Charlotte, North Carolina. My name is Mark Hunter Brooks. I'm the author of the book Earth's Hidden Reality, and I'm a member here at Heartlight. In April, David Hulse, the spiritual director, asked me to speak to you about the process of spiritual development. And in that April presentation,